Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about the Rey Lopez. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop d5 begins the Rey Lopez. And more specifically, we're going to be talking about the Berlin defense. And basically, we're going to be focusing on how to play some of the anti-Berlin systems against the Berlin defense. So anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button, click your notification icon. So anyways, I'm going to be separating these anti-Berlin videos. Unlike my mainline Berlin video, which I did in one video, which ended up being really long. It was like a 20-minute video, but you can check that video out. I'm gonna separate this into 3 different videos, and I'm gonna try to make them shorter to cover basically the 3 types of anti-Berlins that I'm gonna be recommending. So basically, there's gonna be 2 lines within the pawn to d3 anti-Berlin that I'm gonna take a look at in another video at a later date. And then I'm also gonna be showing in this video, we're gonna be focusing on what we call the Nigh Hall attack, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Beginning with this move pawn to d4 as a way to get some position that's different than the regular mainline Berlin. So why do people do stuff like this? Why do we try to play anti-Berlins in the first place? Well, it's because the Berlin is just this slow grind. If you play the main line and you castle, you're going to end up in this slow grind position after knight takes e4, d4, knight d6. Rip, takes here, takes, and you're trying to eventually activate your kingside majority, but it's essentially a slow grind. It takes forever, and a lot of times white doesn't have enough to win. So white's kind of eager to try other stuff. So this leads us to try things like pawn to d4. Now what's interesting about this move pawn to d4, this so-called Nigh Hall attack, it dates all the way back to the Romantic era of chess. Actually, one of the very first practitioners of this was, of course, one of my favorite players, was Paul Morphy. And he had this really cool game, Morphy versus Anderson, played in Paris in 1858, that continued with knight takes d4, which is a move that we would kind of be disgusted by today just to look at. And this was one of the benefits of Morphy. I mean, he was so much better than everybody else, and people just didn't understand how to handle things like tension in the middle of the board, pawn breaks, development, tempos. They didn't get stuff like this, and Morphy did. And they would make mistakes like playing moves like knight d4, which I don't think any modern player would make today. But of course, a lot of that has to do with we got to see all of these Morphy games, so of course we wouldn't make these mistakes today. But the point is whenever you play a move like knight takes d4, when white replies with knight takes d4 and then e takes d4, at some point the queen can come to d4, and when it does, nothing can attack it. There's no knight on c6 covering either the d4 square and also, very importantly, the e5 square. So Morphy continues very correctly. He plays pawn to e5, taking advantage of that kind of vacancy. And then we have pawn to c6, and now we have this move castles kingside, which is, again, very accurate. He doesn't bother to move his bishop. And after Anderson takes, he doesn't take the knight on f6 right away either. He plays this really cool move. He plays bishop to g5, just pinning the knight, and basically just threatening to take on f6 and then play rook e1 check, which is a devastating threat. Anderson has to break the pin. He has to play bishop to e7. If he played, like, for example, h6 here, he would pretty much lose on the spot. Just e takes f6, pawn takes on g5, and then rook e1 check, and you're forced to block with your bishop, and your position is essentially lost. So you just shouldn't keep playing chess after that. So he's smart. He doesn't do that. So instead, he plays bishop e7, just understanding the dangers within the position. And then we have e takes f6, rook e1 check anyway, king f8, bishop f6, queen f6. And now Morphy had this chance. He could have just enjoyed a very, very slight edge with white. He could have just played rook e4, harvested one of his pawns back, and then black's horrible structure, misplaced king, and the fact that he can't develop his queenside at all should yield white a slight advantage. Morphy played in the vein of Morphy. He continued to just develop, activate, move his pieces forward. He plays pawn to c3, offers up another pawn sacrifice, which Anderson declines. He plays pawn to d5, he takes on d4, so Morphy is down a pawn, but the pawn that he's down is this one. It's the doubled pawn on b5, but it is still a pawn, so Anderson tries to hold it. He plays a6. He's done all this suffering. He better keep his pawn. So we have rook e5, rook d8, queen b3, putting more pressure on the middle, queen e7, rook e1, g5, queen d1, threatening to bring the queen into the attack with, queen f3, etc. We have queen f6, I guess preventing queen f3. And then we have rook e3, which sets up, in my mind, a really simple shot that I think normally Anderson would have caught. But in this case, he just completely whiffed. He totally missed it. He plays this move rook g8, and pause the video and see if you can find Anderson's next move. And that move is rook takes e6, essentially ending the game on the spot. Rook takes e6 and Anderson resigns, of course, because if f takes e6, rook e3 pins the queen to the king, and that is the end of the game. So going back to this move, knight takes d4, we're just not lucky enough for people to play this today. So everybody's going to kind of respond pretty correctly. They're going to play e takes d4, understanding that in positions like this, it's important to keep that knight on c6, and it's important to keep white's knight on f3. And if this exchange is going to happen, at the very least, we're going to make white put some effort into it. We're going to make white play knight takes d4. So here, white has kind of two options. White has this move pawn to e5, and white has kind of the mainline Nigh Hall attack, beginning with castle's kingside. So it seems like there's a little bit more promise with castle's kingside. But e5 is still kind of possible as like this alternative weapon. But you can play e5 and then knight e4, and then you can go ahead and castle. And now here, if black plays very lazy chess, like if he plays something like bishop e7 and doesn't put any pressure on your position and just lets you do whatever you want in the middle of the board, white clearly has some sort of advantage here. White can just continue with something like rook e1, and then on something like d5, you would play like ed6, knight d6, bishop c6, and this is actually following a Tal game. This is actually Mateo Cal versus Darga, played in Havana in 1963, and Tal just absolutely destroyed Darga. But I mean, even after just bc6, knight d4, you can sort of see why this position is already extremely difficult to defend, and I certainly wouldn't want to have a position like this with black against somebody that was as skilled at attacking as Mikhail Tal was with white. But this is already somewhere between, slight to major advantage white. So we don't want to play d5, so the alternative is knight c5, and then there's supposed to be two moves that lead to slight advantage white. We can play the sacrifice pawn to c3, which has been played a couple of times, but somehow white didn't win any of the times that white played it. And then after dc3, knight c3, the engine at least gives slight edge white, even though the results have not shown that this is definitely slight edge white. The handful of times that this got played, somehow white still managed to lose. I mean, white is still down a pawn, but this is supposed to be slight edge white. So the alternative to that is just knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and this position is also supposed to be slight edge white, and of course here white is not down a pawn. So for example, just castles knight c3, white has a little bit more space, better development, etc., etc. So this is very reasonable, very clean if black doesn't put any pressure on white's position and plays a move like bishop e7. Of course, black should put pressure on white's position. Black should play a move like pawn to a6. And now, of course, white has to make this call. He has to decide between playing the move bishop to c4 and playing the move bishop takes c6. Neither of which seem to lead to much of anything. If we play bishop to c6 and then d takes c6, knight d4, knight c5, even though the position looks completely equal, is apparently slight edge black according to the engine. But I mean, at least you're not down a pawn or anything like that with the white pieces. So in theory, you could continue to play on from here, but keep in mind the computer assessment is actually slight edge black. So the other option on a6 is you could try bishop c4. This was actually tried between Narayan and Carlsen, played back in 2020. This was a little bit more interesting in terms of the assessment, but all it took was one mistake, and Carlsen had the upper hand. That game continued d5, ed6, knight d6, bishop b3, bishop g4, and this was all well and good. h3 is correct, bishop f3, queen f3, bishop e7, bishop f4. This is all still supposed to be fine. It's all supposed to be fairly close to equality. We have castle's kingside, and then we have this one mistake. We have rook to d1, and after rook to d1, this position is apparently slight edge black. And of course, Carlsen being Carlsen, he never let go, and Carlsen eventually went on to win with the black pieces. Knight d2 was apparently correct, but again, this position is supposed to be nothing more than equal, according to the engine. And of course, when we're playing openings with the white pieces, we're trying to get a slight edge. We're not trying to get equality where we're down a pawn and we're struggling. And, even though we have two bishops in an open position, and it just is just not enough to work with here. Okay, so that's two possibilities involving the move pawn to e5. Of course, the other option is just kind of the mainline Nigh Hall attack, beginning with castle's kingside. This is potentially a little bit more promising, but what's interesting is the line that gives the slightly higher computer assessment, I think, is maybe less promising than the line that gives the slightly lower computer assessment, if that makes any sense. But of course, after castle's kingside, black shouldn't, black should, again, put that pressure on white to do something with his bishop. He should play pawn to a6. And again, white has to make this choice between bishop takes c6 and bishop to a4. So what's interesting about all of this is bishop a4 has a slightly better computer assessment. And actually, there's two top players that tried to play from this position with the white pieces. Magnus Carlsen actually took on c6 in a game against Karyakin, played back in 2012. And Kramnik retreated. He played bishop a4 against Michael Adams back in France back in 2003. So the game against Michael Adams was really short. It went bishop a4 and then bishop e7. We had e5, knight e4, knight takes d4, castles, knight f5. And this is all supposed to be best according to the engine. And black just manages to equalize with d5, e takes d6, bishop f5 takes on e7, knight takes e7, bishop back to b3, and a few more moves here. Knight c5, knight c3, knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes, rook d8, bishop f4, and draw was agreed between Kramnik and Adams. Now, what's interesting about this is, if I look at this visually, I think, well, black must have a slight edge. I mean, we see that white's pawn structure is a little messed up. Each side has the same pieces, knights and bishops. Each side has two pawn islands, so all other things being exactly the same, you would think that black's slightly cleaner pawn structure should be slight edge black. But at least according to the engine, this is actually very, very slight edge white. Probably just because of the pressure that white has on the open c-file and the immediate pressure that white has on c7. This pressure and the fact that white should be able to infiltrate into certain squares, like if black has to play, pawn to c6, we'll have knight a4 infiltrating into, say, c5 or b6. This should be maybe just slight edge white. So they agreed to a draw, though. That even though it's slight edge white, there's really no point to play this out. I mean, pieces are going to get exchanged, hands are going to get, people are going to shake hands anyway. There's just nothing here. So maybe this slightly more interesting try is after a6 we can take on c6. And this is what Magnus Carlsen played against Karyakin, played back in 2012. And that continued d captures c6. We had knight takes d4, bishop c5, pawn to c3. And then we had castles. And what's interesting about this is after f3, the computer gives slight edge black here. And again, this is one of those weird situations where in the last position I was saying, okay, slight edge white, but optically I would think black is better. This is the same thing for me. Like, the computer says slight edge black, but optically I would think white's a little bit better here. White has the cleaner pawn structure in the middle of the board. He's fortified his pieces. He's fortified his center. White has the 4 on 3. Of course, black does have the bishop pair to compensate for that. But all other things being equal, it doesn't seem like white has done enough wrong to lose his slight edge in having more space and having a little bit better position in the middle of the board. So I would think this is actually slight edge white, even though the computer says this is slight edge black. And actually, after a few more moves, it did end up being slight edge white. The game continued knight d7, bishop e3, knight e5, queen e2, and then after queen e7, knight d2. Karyakin apparently made a mistake according to the engine. He played f6, and now at this point the position is very slight edge white instead of slight edge black. So, to me, I mean, the position is probably just equal with chances for both sides, and each side has something slightly different that they're playing for. Black has a bishop pair, white has a nice solid center, and white has a 4 on 3 on the king side, which, if you think about it, is not a whole lot different than just playing the regular Berlin, except for the fact that queens are still on the board. So we don't have that queen exchange happening. So those are basically your options on what you can play in terms of playing, if we go back just in terms of playing this early pawn to d4, and trying this so-called, instead of castles kingside, trying this early d4 and trying this Nigh Hall attack. Basically with the idea of e takes d4 and, employing one of these thoughts moving forward from here, either e5 or castles kingside, just trying to get something different than the super main lines of the Berlin, where you just have this slow grind and a very slight edge with white with no end in sight, where maybe you don't have enough to win and maybe you do. But this gives you an alternative at least to try. Nothing really jumps out as like being spectacular or anything like that. But certainly if your only other alternative is to get an equally equal position in the main line of the Berlin, these lines all start looking a little bit more reasonable. So anyways, I hope you learned something new about chess. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.